we are really blessed. We've not only got an outstanding guest speaker, we've actually got a program which is going to, I hope, make the most of the content and the ideas that are on the table here. And I think if nothing else about this moment of change, it is because we are sick and tired of a prevailing narrative which is boring, which is causing grief and strife and inequality, and we are looking to create the new narrative. And all in this room, I think, are the type of people who are looking for what that narrative might be. And I'm not going to try and put a label on it. I'll go as far as saying I look for a progressive narrative, but I'm not going to go further at this point and elaborate, because I think the nature of our discussion and the nature of our voting will actually give rise to a variety of positions, and it all will be revealed. Tonight, though, we are lucky to have a very big part of that alternative narrative on the table. The idea that we must reform our income, we must think again about the values that underpin the economy, we must think again about the values that underpin the nature of a productive and social and environmentally friendly community, call it an economy if you will. And to do that, we're asking Guy to speak, and then we've got a panel of two very interesting commentators from New Zealand, both known for their incisive analysis of issues of this sort. And then we've got, I think, members of the Auckland Debating Society who are going to toss the idea around that there are ways that we can approach the idea of a basic income, targeting universal, conditional, so on. So without further ado, can I say that it's going to be my job to try and share this thing tonight, and I'm looking forward to welcome Guy Standing. Guy.
Okay. Well, it's great to be here. It's my fourth visit to New Zealand, and I've fallen in love with the country, as all my friends know, so I'm delighted to be here, even if it's the wrong time of year. And I want to begin by saying something that I said last night in Hamilton, a talk on the precariat. And I apologize to those who were there last night for my repeating this, but I think it's appropriate. This year is the 800th anniversary of a founding document of not only the British Constitution, but the Constitution of all democracies in the world. It was a very radical, even subversive document. It was the first class-based set of demands accepted by the state, by the monarchy, against their will. It accompanied the sealing of what in 1217 became the Magna Carta. But the Magna Carta is celebrated across the world by the bourgeois interests, by capital, by the American Bar Association, and huge celebrations were organized by the British government, American government, in 2015, when the original Charter of Liberty was sealed in Runnymede. But nobody seems to understand that alongside the Magna Carta that was sealed on the 6th of November 1217 was that other twin document. And everybody on the left, everywhere, should arrange for some celebratory events in the remainder of this year. And I'm very pleased that I had a discussion with John McDonnell and others last night on Skype, and we've set in train a series of events in the UK to celebrate the Charter of the Forest. Now, the Charter of the Forest was the first document in history to assert that the common man and woman had a right to subsistence. And they had a right to subsistence by having access to the commons, to the forest. And the forest in those days referred to all the open spaces and the communities, not just woodlands. And actually, for hundreds of years, it was the Charter of the Forest that led the Magna Carta, not the other way around. And for hundreds of years, every church in England had to read it out in entirety 4 times a year. It was that foundational. But of course, it was always subject to class struggle, always subject to enclosure, taking away the commons, to privatization, to commercialization, notoriously under the Tudors, but right the way through the 19th century. But it has the privilege of having been on the statute books longer than any other piece of legislation anywhere in history. 754 years. It was only repealed by a Tory government, bless their little hearts, if they've got any, in 1971. Repealed by a document which was all about protecting wild creatures. The long title of the new Act of 1971 is almost Monty Python in its verbiage. But of course, by then they had taken out the subversive, radical right to subsistence for the common man and woman. And I'm delighted that the Labour Party in Britain is going to be having these events. We're organising it. We're going to have an event in Lincoln, which is where one of the only 2 originals are kept. And I tell you, to stand in front of it is an emotional experience. It's one big parchment, 17 articles. You stand in front of it, and if you're not affected by awe, then you're not human. So we're having a big event in Lincoln, and it's very timely because, against all expectations, I've been to Lincoln and I've been giving some talks and radical groups. They were all down in the dumps in May because they thought we were going to be wiped out in Lincoln. But the Labour Party won. Most unexpected in Lincoln. And we're going to have an event in Durham. I'm due to speak in Durham Cathedral. I'll have to put a tie on, like our chair of BINZ, who's got a tie on this evening for the event, on the day. Fantastic. With some Marxist and other radical historians, which are fantastic. And on November the 7th, in the House of Commons, we're going to have a celebratory event chaired by Jeremy Corbyn and John. And I think it's symbolic, and it's so relevant in New Zealand, so relevant for the Maori debates about retaining and reviving and regaining the commons. I didn't expect to speak so long about it, but you can probably guess that it's an emotional experience. We're starting it by going up the Thames in a barge to Runnymede and have an event under the Ankerwick tree, the Ankerwick yew, which is 2,500 years old, and it was there that King John had to seal what became the Magna Carta. Very symbolic, a lot of symbolism. Now this evening, to do a bit of advertising, apologies for that, I'm going to be talking about my new book, Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen. Just come out, and since I was last in New Zealand, there must be something in the water internationally. Because I'm getting a little worried that I've suddenly become respectable. I'm truly, genuinely worried. I was talking to Darren about it. He's probably washed his hands, won't speak to me again. But last year I got invited to talk about the precariat and basic income by the Bilderberg group. Now, those of you who know about the Bilderberg group will know it's the right-wing elite of the world. And I initially didn't accept. I thought it was a joke. A Marxist friend of mine winding me up. Didn't respond, but then 3 days later I got a call at my house from the secretary of the Bilderberg group saying, no, we've been asking you to come. I said, oh. So I consulted all my lefty friends around Europe, and to a man and a woman they said, go. Tell them about the precariat, tell them about basic income. So the long and the short of it is that I went, and there were a smaller number of people than in this room now. And imagine how I felt when I was introduced, talking for an hour on the precariat and basic income, sitting there, staring at me like an owl, was Henry Kissinger. Now, when I was a student, he was the man we hated more than anybody else in the world. And the annoying thing is, although he's 93, he's still as sharp as nails. That was the disappointing thing. I wanted him to be gaga, you know. I hope this is not being videoed or recorded. And what happened was that he sat there. Next to him was Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, 2 US presidential candidates, the head of the CIA, the head of MI6, 3 prime ministers, 2 kings, the head of Google, the head of Facebook, all of that stuff, right? So for an hour, I was talking about the precariat and basic income, and I genuinely thought they would all run for the bar, proverbially. Instead, I noticed after about 10 minutes, a whole lot of them, including Christine Lagarde, were all taking notes. And at the end of it, after I'd said, this was beginning of last June, I said, don't be surprised if the precariat, or part of it, vote for Donald Trump and have him elected. And don't be surprised if that part of it in the UK vote for Brexit and Brexit. And all of those people there were against Trump, to the main part, as far as they would speak about it, and against Brexit. And since that meeting in Bilderberg, I have to confess that I've been treated as a respectable human being, and I got invited to Davos to give 3 speeches at Davos. One on corruption of capitalism, the subject of my last book, one on the precariat, and one on basic income. And what has been happening in this last 2 years is extraordinary, because across the world, a huge number of people across the political spectrum have been coming out in favor of basic income. There's a danger there, we know that. But when you get the head of Google coming out, the head of Facebook coming out, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, whole lot of Silicon Valley types coming out, big corporate chief executives coming out, church leaders coming out. Suddenly, there's a new legitimacy. We have to be very careful, very careful. But now finally some trade unions. Andy Stern in the United States has come out. He's become some sort of guru overnight. I don't think he really knows much about basic income, but he's written a book saying he believes in it. So I'm delighted that he's coming. This is a new phase in the debate. You can no longer have a prime minister stand up and say this idea is barking mad. Because you can say, listen, I'm in good company. So we are in a new phase. And then I got this commission to write this book for Penguin good thing about it is it's cheap, to bring together all the evidence and thinking of what has been a long journey for myself of over 35 years of working for a basic income. As everybody in BINZ knows, we set up BINZ in September 1986, so we had our 30th anniversary, and we're about to have our 17th Congress in Portugal, and there are pilots that I'll briefly discuss that are taking place in numerous parts of the world. Now, to come to the subject, after a long sort of side view, the interesting thing is that we have to justify why we believe in a basic income. And I think it's important to start by saying very clearly what the basic income is. And the first chapter of the book goes through the various definitions and the various names. And I think the way it's going to be framed is going to be a very important part of the next phase. If we get the wording wrong, if we get the rationales wrong, we'll alienate more people than we need to. But if we get it right, then we can really galvanize and take a surge forward in the debate. And that is a key theme that runs, I hope, runs through the book. I don't like the term universal basic income or unconditional basic income. Basic income or social dividend is a way of framing. If you talk about unconditional, you open up a can of worms, which are discussed in the book. It is in principle unconditional, but there are conditions, like residence, citizenship, or whatever. If you talk about universal, ditto, it sets too many things going. You mean for the whole world? You get questions that are unnecessary. And I think the name is an important thing. I think it's quite possible that we may actually win the debate with a different name for basic income. It's quite possible. Not just saying it will be, but it may well be that it's an easier way to do it if we call it a social dividend, a sharing of wealth, rather than a basic income, which sounds as if this is a question of efficiency and just poverty or something. But that's discussed at length in that chapter. Now, the argument I've been trying to make for all these years is that a basic income is justified for ethical reasons. It's justified first and foremost because it is a matter of social justice. The wealth and income of all of us is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of our ancestors, like generations before us. Something the Maoris can teach everybody, but it's a thing that all of us should know. We should have the humility to understand that our collective wealth, the Bill Gates wealth, is due to the achievements and contributions of a huge number of people before him. And if you go back to Thomas Paine and agrarian justice, and I quote from Paine in chapter 2 at some length, the idea that land and the commons is collectively owned, and the acts of privatization and enclosure merely contributes to the growth of economic rent for a tiny minority. And the theme of this book, which was I tried to write as the third part of the trilogy on the precariat, is that we have morphed out of a neoliberal economy into a rentier economy, rentier capitalism, where more and more of the wealth of the world and the income of the world is going to the ownership of property, physical, financial, and intellectual property. And this is a rigged system. I was asked to present this book by Dreamforce by the head of Dreamforce, multi-billionaire, who is named by Forbes as the entrepreneur of the decade. So he asked me to San Francisco to address a big number of chief executives. At the end of my presentation, he stood up, he's a big chap. He said, "What you're saying is our economic system is totally rigged." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I agree." That's a multi-billionaire who's been at the top, okay? And I think that our rentier economy is completely amoral, as well as being economically inefficient. It is totally unjustified. So the first justification for a basic income is to say that this is a matter of sharing the collective wealth by social dividend from the wealth that's created. And I give the example, which is very meaningful for me, of Middlesbrough. And Middlesbrough, those of you who have heard me talk about it before, is a very symptomatic, emblematic place in England. In 1820, it was a tiny village. And then they discovered iron ore. And by the late 1830s, Middlesbrough and Teesside around it was the hub of the Industrial Revolution, the hub of the British Empire, the hub of wealth creation. And the owners of the mills and the factories and everything tended to move south with their wealth from the mines. Today, if you go to Middlesbrough, you will find the old houses closed up, the windows with concrete blocks, weeds growing everywhere, the precariat hanging around on street corners with little to do and no income to spend. And the toffs, or the descendants of the toffs, who are even bigger toffs now, living down in the south of England, are wealthy and living with privileges. And if you think about it, you could say that this is intergenerational inequity magnified. And for me, a basic income is a small way of redressing that intergenerational inequity. Now, those who say that a basic income would be something for nothing should shut their little mouths up. Because the wealthy in this world inherit vast somethings for nothings. And many of the people who earn rental income, I've just been looking at the great landowners who've been assembling vast rental incomes. They've done very, very, very little for very, very large amounts of rental income. That argument is just pure hypocrisy, whether it's from John Key or anybody else who wishes to say it. There are also religious rationales in terms of social justice. I'm not a religious man, but I've put the rationales in the book from Christian perspective, Jewish perspective, and Muslim perspective. I think it's a good one, and I like the argument that a Christian would give, which is that God's grace endows people with different endowments. And in a sense, a basic income would be a compensation for those who don't have the sort of endowments that would lead to them becoming successful, wealthy, and privileged. It's a good argument. Now, the social justice, there are other arguments which I talk about, Rawlsian theory, various other philosophical traditions. But I think that's the most important reason of all. The second reason is, and this is the next chapter, the second reason is that a basic income would enhance freedom. It would enhance liberal freedom, the ability to make choices, the ability to say no, to say yes, And it would also enhance, which is much more important, the sense of republican freedom. Going back to Aristotle and the tradition of republican freedom that goes through Hannah Arendt, which is the ability to act in concert and the ability to avoid being subject to the unaccountable will of the other. A husband, a bureaucrat, a boss, a this, a that. If you have a basic income, you have the power not only to say no, but also to feel that you are responsible for your own control of your life. To a certain extent. Not maximized, of course, we shouldn't exaggerate, but it moves in that direction. So it strengthens republican freedom. Now, what we found in our pilots in India, which is written up in another book, I have a few copies if anybody's interested. We did this pilot where we provided 6,000 people in 9 villages with basic income for 18 months, and we compared what happened with 6,000 other people who didn't receive the basic income. And I was going to the villages during the course of our pilot, and I said, look, we're only providing a basic income of about 40% of subsistence income. Not a lot. And yet, we're seeing big effects, including emancipatory effects, where women were able to control of what they wanted to do. And we puzzled about it. And then I realized that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value. The argument I develop in the book, if you're interested, at some length, and I've become convinced that this is the case, partly because if you are in a low-income community or a low-income household or you're part of the precariat, what is your scarce commodity? Money. And what happens when a commodity is scarce? The price goes up. So for the poor, the price of money is much higher than for the rich. And so they have to, if they have an illness or they have a problem, they have to borrow at short term at 100% interest rates, more. Same with the precariat, they often have to go to Wonga or whatever it might be at 1,000% of interest. But if you have a basic income in the community, when somebody is hit, they have a greater sense of personal resilience and a greater sense of being able to look to the community to provide a cooperative response. And that's precisely what was happening. So I went to one village, and some women, they'd obviously been preparing for this, for my next visit, you know. I realized very quickly, because they came across and said, we want to speak to you. I know, yes. There's one group in our village, one group, who hates basic income, hates it. I said, what? The money lenders. I said, well, you can't please everybody. And that sense of emancipation is very, very important. The third reason, which is the subject of the next chapter, is that basic income not only reduces poverty or inequality, it does, but I would argue that this is not the primary reason for supporting a basic income. There are lots of schemes that could reduce poverty. There are lots of schemes that could reduce inequality, but what is unique about a basic income is that they can do these things while providing people with the most important thing in life, basic security. And security is an essential need of all of us. Not total security, but basic security. We know from psychological research that people who are insecure suffer a diminishing of their IQ. It happens. Has anyone in this room been insecure for any length of time? Exactly. And if you are honest enough, you know that your intelligence suffers, your ability to solve problems, your ability to confront hardships or whatever diminishes there too. And the same thing happens with all of us. Our IQ goes down, your mental bandwidth, as the psychologists call it, goes down. By contrast, if you provide security, the opposite happens. I was telling Darren this morning, I discuss it in the book, what I've called the accidental pilot. Very relevant if we were to do a pilot of the Maori community here, was done in an area of North Carolina where the Cherokee Indians have a big community. And by chance, one of the nearby universities just launched a child development longitudinal research project that was going to go on for 20 years. When the Cherokee community decided that the profits from their casino, all of the profits, were going to be distributed to the families in the form of a basic income. And what happened very interestingly was that they mapped over 20 years. And after about 15 years, they found that the children in the families where they'd had basic income were on average 1 year ahead in school than the children who had not been in families receiving the basic income. If anybody doesn't think that's a powerful empirical result, they're a jackass or something else. Basic security has also been shown to make people more altruistic, more tolerant of strangers, more tolerant of other people with different views. It makes people better citizens. And right now, when we've had the election of a total bastard as President of the United States, it's a rather important fact. And one of the reasons why these corporate executives have come round to supporting or being interested in a basic income is precisely that. Insecure people make dangerous people. And they vote for populist neo-fascists. And a basic income is attractive because it would reduce individual, household, family, community insecurities. The next chapter deals with the economic arguments, and the idea, I think, that is really important for us to emphasize is that if you had a basic income, it would emphasize more ecologically sustainable growth. Forms of growth that we should be in favor of encouraging. It would reward work that is not labor. It would encourage us to have greater respect for the preservation of resources and the reproductive nature of our life. And it would combat rentier capitalism. And it leads to the argument, which is very relevant for the affordability questions which are dealt with later, that if you had a basic income, it would be the equivalent of a quantitative easing for people. Instead of giving billions and billions of dollars or pounds or euros or then to the financiers, merely increasing inequality, rewarding those who created the crises in the first place, if you had a basic income paid to everybody, you would stimulate growth, you would reduce inequality, you would increase security, and don't tell me it's not affordable. Because you've proved it's affordable by giving all this money to the bankers. I sometimes get the first letter wrong, but I won't know. Now, the next chapter, which I'm not going to go through because it's too painful, but it's one reason why I hope a lot of people will buy and read the book, deals with all the objections I've heard over these 30 years. There are a lot of objections. I think there are a total of 17 of major objections. You've heard them all. I've tried to answer them all. It's up to the readers to decide whether I've done that competently or not. Funnily enough, the book that's come out in the UK and here has the subtitle, "And How We Can Make It Happen." But after it was put into the press, Yale University Press bought the rights for a US edition of the book, which came out 2 days ago, and they wanted to change the subtitle. And the subtitle for the American edition, which I rather like, which I negotiated, "A Guide for the Open-Minded." Because what I tried to do is give the devil a good shot. I've stated and quoted those who've made the objections, and I've given what I believe are the answers to that. Now, the next chapter deals with one of the two elephants in the room. Is it affordable to pay a basic income? Well, you can approach that from saying, well, what is it that's affordable? You can start with a very low amount and build it, or you can go for a big amount, and in that case, of course, it's harder to afford. Or you can say, okay, does this mean that you have to raise taxes? Or is it a matter of priority? So you switch from some items to basic income. I think it's a mixture of both. I strongly believe that the left should be advocating the development of sovereign wealth funds to help fund it, land value tax, capturing the rent, levies on rental income. And I did a little calculation, very interesting, using freedom of information. And I'm looking at subsidies, which I've discussed in the other book at length. The fact is that the New Zealand government, British government, American government give corporations and the wealthy vast subsidies. Billions in subsidies every year. It's not taken into account enough by the left. The potential of using those subsidies, because they're regressive, they don't encourage efficiency, they don't stimulate growth. They are built by the wealthy for the wealthy. And I did a little calculations showing that in Britain, according to the government's own figures, there are something like 1,250 tax reliefs. In other words, these are little schemes to enable people to avoid having to pay any tax. Imagine, 1,250. And the value of the biggest 109 of those tax reliefs comes to £400 billion per year. But to give you some idea of what that means, the total spending on the NHS, National Health Service, social housing, and education by the state is somewhat less than that. So your tax reliefs, which are regressive and unjustifiable, could pay for a basic income. Don't tell me you don't pay for it. The amount of money potentially raisable without raising direct taxation is substantial, very substantial. But I won't go into that. If you're interested, they're discussed at length. The other next chapter, which I'm also not going to go through at any length, is a chapter very close to my heart. The argument is, by the critics, if you gave people a basic income, they would become lazy and not do any work. I always say this is an insult to the human condition. It's an insult to think that we don't want to improve our lives. It's an insult to think that we don't want to have better living standards for our children, our relatives, our community. It's an insult. But fortunately, the evidence is also on our side. One of the undoubted findings of our basic income pilots in India and Africa have been that it increased the amount of work people were doing, increasing the productivity of work. And other pilots are finding a similar sort of results. But it's vital in this debate to make sure that we reconceptualize what we mean by work. My friends here know that I'm a bore on this subject, but it's vitally important that we reconceptualize what work amounts to. Our official statistics are crap. Our official statistics are distortionary. They are things that every feminist should be shouting about all the time. And I look back to Labour Party and the Fabians, and a lot of left, and they're as bad as any other. Really bad. Only Labour counts. What about all the work that women in particular do? What about all the work that's created? What about all the leisure that is actually productive? We need to capture our time. I need to be able to develop our capabilities, our all-around personalities, our creativity, our energies. And unless you reconceptualize what you mean by work, you get trapped in the laborist trap. And I plead for us to move away from that paradigm. I go through the evidence. I'm pretty convinced that the basic income increases the amount of work we will do. But the sort of work we do will be different from just labor. The next chapter, you'll be glad to know, I'm not going to even go through it, goes through all the alternatives that have been proposed from left and right to a basic income. Things like a job guarantee. I always think, what the flip is that going to mean? What sort of job are they going to guarantee that I have? Right now, I might like to become Prime Minister of New Zealand. Can you guarantee me any of that job? I can't even guarantee Jacinta that job right now. So, it doesn't make sense. It leads inevitably to workfare, coercion, conditionality, BINZ testing, and all of that stuff. But I go through all those alternatives, and then I go to one of the surprising developments, the longest chapter in terms of words, which I don't have time to go through either, but is a real surprise to all my friends, including myself, in the basic income movement of the last 30 years. When we set out, we thought getting a basic income in rich Western European countries would be the first. We thought that's where we would gain it first. But in the last 5 years, suddenly it's become sexy in developing countries. Suddenly, and it is suddenly, developmental aid, people are thinking cash transfers. Most direct way of confronting poverty and insecurity. Give people cash. Wow. Genius. And remarkably, after we did our pilots and after the book came out, we had a big conference in Delhi. Very interesting, because beforehand, all the big shots had said, what nonsense. And Sonia Gandhi had even told us, she said, you're wasting the money, they're all going to spend it on alcohol and tobacco and, sex. Things like that. Shopping. And at the end of the pilot, she asked for a presentation, and she said she wished she'd known the results on nutrition, welfare, schooling, health. And suddenly we did this conference earlier this year, and all these big shots wanted to come to our conference. Very strange. Head of IMF, head of this, head of that, head of the planning commission, minister, this cabinet minister. And remarkably, and you can imagine how my arm, all the hair was sticking up, on the 31st of January this year, the Minister of Finance of India tabled a report with a budget saying a basic income is affordable in India. And you're going to see in the next couple of months, UNCTAD is going to come out in favour. They've just commissioned a report which I've completed. UNICEF is coming out in favour. The IMF are having a big debate. They've asked me to go and talk. There's a sea change taking place, and it can't come soon enough. Now, the next chapter discusses all the pilots that are taking place now. I hope you will have interest in reading about other pilots, because I really hope that a pilot is done in this country. Whichever government comes in, some means of launching a pilot has to be found. I believe it can be done. I believe it could be done in a Maori community and have great potential for many things. And the last chapter is, how do we do it? How do we get it? And it begins with a story which I think is true about Franklin Roosevelt. He was in the White House early in his presidency, and he received a delegation in the White House who came with a particular policy. And they spent about 40 minutes or whatever trying to persuade him. No doubt they were as earnest as I am, really trying to. But at the end of it, after he'd asked a few questions, he said, "Right, you've convinced me. Now go out and force me to do it." And we are at that stage, I believe. We have to give the politicians the backbone to move in that direction. Last time I was in this country, I was invited by the Labour leadership, Andrew Little and Grant, to talk of the future of the work, and I had discussions with them beforehand, and they were telling me they favour moving in the direction of basic income. One shot across their heads from Key, and they duck. They haven't got the backbone yet. But it's up to us, it's up to all of us to put that pressure and give them the backbone, help them. Because politicians in general are not very courageous. They need to be forced to do things. And we are at that stage, and I can tell you in many countries, movements are gaining strength. I'm going to Spain, Podemos, various other countries, you see movements in its favor. So that is why in the end, I'm actually quite confident that we will move in that direction. Thank you very much.